Welcome everyone to the second video of Outliers. In this video, we will see the most common outlier detection technique and how to implement it. Outlier detection, interquartile range. IQR is another popular technique for detecting outliers. Outliers are data points that fall 1.5 times of IQR above Q3 and below Q1. So what are the steps for detection of outliers using this technique? The dataset should be stored ascending. Calculate the first and third quartiles. Compute the IQR, which is actually subtracting the Q3 from Q1. Then compute the lower bound, which is actually Q1 minus 1.5 multiplied by IQR, and also upper bound, which is Q3 plus 1.5 multiplied by IQR. Then in the last, loop through the dataset's value and any values that deviate from the higher or lower bounds are flagged as outliers. Now let's have a look at IQR technique. So this is an IQR diagram. This part is the 25th percentile. This is the median part. And this is the 75th percentile, which contains 75% of the observations from the dataset. So overall, this diagram is of a box or whisker plot. So these values which are above upper quartile are known as possible outliers. And the values which will be below from lower extreme quartile or first quartile will be outliers. Everything inside that is a normal value. Now let's implement what we have learned so far. Now, first of all, I will open Jupyter Notebook. Now I will open the folder of outliers. From here, I will create a new notebook. First of all, let's rename the notebook Outliers Part 2. I will create a markdown as usual. Import libraries. Import numpy as np. Import matplotlib.pyplot is plt. Import pandas as pd. Import seaborn as sns. Let's create another markdown for CSV files. Cars equals to cars pd dot read CSV and then data dot CSV. As it's a comma separated value file, so I will say sep equals to comma. Now cars dot head. All right. So first of all, I will do some cleaning of data by choosing a markdown at first, data cleaning. At first, I will drop all of the no values from the dataset. Then I will say cars dot columns equals to cars dot columns dot scr dot lower. I will convert the column names into lowercase and I will replace the spaces inside columns names with an underscore. All right, so cars dot head. Okay, we are good to go. So I will use Markdown for using the technique of IQR. Now, IQR is the technique that is used for the columns that are purely numerical, such as engine horsepower, engine cylinders, highway MPG, city MPG, popularity MSRP. Now let's suppose I want to calculate the outliers for engine horsepower. So first of all, I will find out the first and the third quartile. So I will say Q1 and Q3 equals to NP dot percentile. Now calculate the percentile for the column of engine horsepower and calculate the first and the third quartile and store it in these variables. Now, first of all, I will find the IQR by saying Q3 minus Q1. The next step is to find upper bound and the lower bound. So for upper bound, I will say all of the values that are above the Q3 quartile and 1.5 multiplied by IQR are outliers. So for the same, I will say lower bound equals to all of the values that are below Q1 1.5 multiplied by IQR are outliers. Now the next step is to store outliers. So these outliers for engine horsepower. So I will say HP out. So HP refers to horsepower and out refers to outliers. And I will say cars and cars engine horsepower greater than upper bound, or if the car's engine horsepower values are smaller than lower bound, then store them into the HP out outliers. Now I will say print HP out. So as you can see that the outliers are 562, 597, and so on. So these values are from the head, and the lines below these three dots are from the tail. Now, as you can see that HP out does not have only engine horsepower. It has all of the values of columns that are associated with the outlier of engine horsepower, such as 562 engine horsepower outlier is in the make Ferrari and the model 458 Italia. Now let's suppose if we want only to store the engine horsepower and the index or the row in which we have outlier. So I will say HP equals to PD dot data frame and make a data frame of HP out and take only the column of engine horsepower. Let's run it. Now I will say HP dot head. As you can see that the rows and the outlier values are in this data frame. And similarly, I can find out the outliers for other columns too. Now let's suppose if you only want the values that are outliers in our desired columns, and then you want them to append or store them in a list, then you will say, first, let me create a markdown appending all the outlier values in a list. So first of all, I will create an empty list of outliers. Now I will create a list of the columns for whom I want to find out the outliers. Like I said earlier that we can only use the technique of IQR on purely numerical columns. So I will say engine HP, highway MPG, and city MPG, popularity, and in the last M is RP. Now I will say for I in columns, first of all, I will store the value of column in column. Now, as usual, I will calculate the first quartile at first by saying np dot percentile and calculate the percentile for the column which is currently the engine HP. Find out the first quartile and similarly find out the third quartile. 75. Now I will calculate the IQR by saying Q3 minus Q1. Then the lower bound is Q1 minus 1.5 multiplied by IQR. And the upper bound is Q3 plus 1.5 multiplied by IQR. Now we'll say for I in column, loop through each and every element of the column, and our current column is engine horsepower. So if the value is smaller than the lower bound, or if the value I is greater than the upper bound, then append this outlier value into the list outliers. And in the end, I will say print outliers, and I will print it. As you can see, here are all the values that are outliers. From here to here, these are the values of engine horsepower. And from here, we have the values of highway MPG that are outliers. And similarly for city MPG, here is for popularity, and these values are in the column of MSRP. So let's suppose you want to see that how many outliers we have in the dataset. So what is the length? You will say print the length of outliers so that you will see the number of outliers. So there are 2,138 in numbers. Now let's go back to slides. So, this is the end of today's lecture. You have learned how to find out outliers of specific columns using the technique of IQR and how you can see the length of the outliers. So, this is your homework. I have placed the link of dataset here, and these are your tasks. So, the first task is to detect outlier rows using IQR technique. Then detect outlier values using the IQR technique. In the next video, we will see how to handle outliers. Until then, good luck. See you next time.